Hello and welcome, fellow time travellers. It's always great to have you along for the ride with Paul and I as we hurtle together through space and time, through at least 1,000,000 years of history, maybe more. But before we get started, I want to say a huge thanks to everyone who's been helping and is continuing to help to support this podcast by signing up to my Patreon presence. Every week on Patreon, you'll get a new video from me about how history collides with, overlaps with the present. Paying attention to those overlaps can be very informative about the present day. I helplessly offer up a bit of my personal philosophy, but that's just because it's woven through the way that I think and speak. If you're not a member yet and you want to join, go to patreon.com, search for me by name, Neil Oliver, and join up. It'll help support the free podcast, which as of the last couple of weeks has been Neil Oliver's Love Letter to the World. But along the way, as Patreon members, you get all sorts of extra material and you become part of the family of time travellers, so what's not to like? Right, it's now time to strap yourself into the time machine. Make sure there's diesel in the tank, and here's the next episode of my love letter to the British Isles. Cue the music. This material is so valuable that it's worth dying for, and we want as much of it as we can get. In this podcast, we're going deep below ground into the belly of a mountainous sea serpent, writhing and wriggling through dangerously claustrophobic tunnels, encountering caverns of cathedral-like dimensions, discovering the drive and determination of our ancient ancestors as they dug the largest prehistoric copper mine in the world. I'm stepping out across Britain to discover 100 remarkable places that have shaped you, me, and the whole world. I'm Neil Oliver, and this is my love letter to the British Isles.
Last week we travelled to Cornwall and the beginning of the Bronze Age, discovering one of the richest sources of tin in the ancient world. Where are we now?
Well, today we're off to find the other metal that the world needed if it was to make bronze. That's the alloy that was powering the new age, the Bronze Age. We're in Clwyd, in North Wales, at the Great Orme, in search of copper. If you're going to make bronze, you need tin and copper. There's just no ways around it. That's what you need to make a bronze sword. You've got to get your hands on copper and tin in a ratio of about 9 times as much copper as you've got tin. It's about 9 to 1. So we were talking last time about the mining for tin that was going on in Cornwall, down in that peninsula of England that sticks out into the Atlantic down there in the southwest. Well, the other half of the equation is the copper. And for the ancient world, what made the British Isles doubly attractive was that they could find copper and tin together in the one set of islands. So you could get tin in Cornwall and you could get copper in Wales. So what we're talking about this time is the copper mining at Llandudno, which is right up in the north, on the north coast of Wales. For a long time, archaeologists were determined, and historians were determined, that there was no major mining or copper extraction in the British Isles until the Romans came. You know, so the Romans are in the British Isles from around the time of Jesus Christ onwards. You know, around the year 0, if you like. The Roman contact is there, and the belief was that it was them that industrialised the extraction of elements like copper. So it was a huge surprise when much more recently archaeologists working at Llandudno, and based on that, on research that they were able to do there, they realised that there was what you could justifiably describe as industrial extraction of malachite, which is the ore from which you get copper, at Llandudno 4,000 years ago.
Wow.
So 2,000 years, really, before the Romans even thought about it, there was large-scale mining for copper in North Wales, whatever they called North Wales. That's one of the fascinations for me all the time, is what in ancient times, how people described and referred to these places. We don't have, and we never will have, those names, which is a great loss. But anyway, 4,000 years ago, they were extracting a massive amount of copper, and that's indigenous population. That's the people who are naturally there in that part of the British Isles. It's a homegrown industry. They're extracting copper, and they must have been doing it for trade reasons because of the sheer volume. It's been calculated that during the lifetime of the mine at Llandudno, something like 1,700 tonnes of malachite was extracted and converted into copper. Now, think about what that actually means. You're talking about maybe 10 million axe heads worth of copper. So it's on that. This isn't people messing about. This isn't just tinkering around the edges. This is a massive exercise. There was copper mining at Llandudno right up into the modern era.
In the same place?
It's only relatively recently gone out of business. It was a copper mine right up into into modern times. And it was on account of the modern workings that the older workings, the prehistoric workings, had been lost. They were just completely overlooked by the modern industry. And it was only when the mine shut down that archaeologists were able to get in amongst it and find where the prehistoric workings had been. And one of the discoveries was of a chamber that had been created by the digging out of malachite ore thousands of years ago. It left an empty space, a void. But at some point it had been deliberately backfilled with rubble. So the space was filled up. Well, archaeologists painstakingly emptied that chamber back out again. And when they got it emptied, they discovered that what they had was the largest man-made underground chamber anywhere on planet Earth. The hole that had been left behind as just part of those prehistoric copper mining works was the largest hole made by human beings underground anywhere on planet Earth. It's a truly vast space, and you can walk into that. And remember, it's dug out by people using stone and bone. They were mining, digging into the ore using animal bones and stones. Those were their tools.
It must have been incredible hard work.
It doesn't bear thinking about. As well as the big chamber, archaeologists have emptied out a few hundred metres of the tunnels that were created by the digging. If you imagine people burrowing into the malachite ore, just following it wherever it went, and pushing it out behind them like moles or badgers digging. And archaeologists have emptied out a few hundred metres of these tunnels. But it's estimated that there's something like at least 5 miles of tunnels, prehistoric mining at Llandudno. So all that's been excavated so far is between about sort of 3 and 5% of what's actually there. And some of the tunnels are sort of big enough to, walk in, sort of bent double, bent right over like a half-shut knife. And then you get into other places where you're kind of down on your knees, crawling through. And then finally it comes down to spaces that in some cases are so confined and confining, little twisting tunnels, that they can only reasonably have been excavated by children. They're so small. So the prehistoric miners must have been using their children to get into some of the more confined spaces. And you have to, when you talk about the work involved, you have to think about, it's one thing to go into a tunnel that's there, that you can get through and out the other side, or into a chamber. But these people, when they were mining, and some of them are children, are up against a dead end because they're working into the rock. So they must have gone down as far as had already been opened up, probably with a little lamp, maybe, with made of animal fat or something. And then they'd be right up against the face, and they were digging this out with bone and stone, and maybe people working behind them, scraping that material out and taking it back up to the surface. Some people have even speculated that it may have been dangerous to work with a lamp down there because a burning lamp is using up some of the oxygen, because you're in a confined space. So, horror of horrors, you might have had people and children working down there in the dark, in the total darkness, extracting the malachite. So think about what that was like. Now, for filming purposes, I've filmed, documentaries about this sort of stuff, and I got the opportunity to crawl through one of these tunnels. Not one that had been dug by a child, but one that was sort of adult-sized, if you like. So I was wearing, a sort of cotton boiler suit, a sort of onesie thing, with my helmet, with a lamp on it, and welly boots, and I was shown down into this opening, and I had to crawl through it, and I swear to you, it was no more than maybe 2 feet in diameter, and it wasn't, a smooth round pipe. It was all twists and turns because the miner had just followed where the malachite ore was within the limestone, and so sometimes as I was crawling through, sometimes I had to turn on my side, and you're deep underground. Remember, it's many meters, many tens of meters under the surface. And sometimes I had to lie flat on my back with my nose brushing against the ceiling of the tunnel as I wriggled and kicked and struggled through this tunnel. If claustrophobia has a sound, then it's the sound of your own Wellington boots scrabbling for purchase in a little tunnel as you try to not get stuck. I remember on the surface when I was getting kitted up, the woman who had given me my boiler suit and was talking to me about it, she said, "This sounds a little bit almost counterintuitive," she said, "but if you feel yourself getting stuck, you mustn't panic." And she said, I know that doesn't make sense because you think you will panic if you get stuck. But she said, you have to remember that the first thing your body will do if you panic is it'll want to take a big deep breath because it'll be getting you ready for big effort. And she said, the last thing you want to do is make yourself any bigger. So she said, if you panic, you'll breathe in a big breath. So if you're stuck before, you'll be even more stuck then. So it was with these sort of thoughts in my mind that I was down there. And it's one of those rare opportunities that I've ever had where you really do feel as if you're at least absolutely in the same physical circumstances as somebody was in 4,000 years ago. You think this is the place, and this is what it's like to be down here, trapped in this little claustrophobic hole. And the only light down here is light that I've brought with me. So you get a real feeling of, empathy for what those miners were going through. But it's just yet another example. You talk about, there we go, look at the figures, the biggest man-made chamber anywhere on the planet of the prehistoric era, 1,700 tons of material, 10 million axe heads worth. That's how important that part of the British Isles was to the ancient world. That's how pricelessly valuable copper was. They were prepared to imagine the life. I mean, these must have been people who were spending days, weeks, working down there in the dark at constant threat of cave-ins and, the whole thing collapsing on them or injury or all the rest of it. That's how much it mattered to get hold of copper. And that's 4,000 years ago. People were thinking in that way. This material is so valuable that it's worth dying for. And we want as much of it as we can get.
Would these early Bronze Age miners have been a similar physical size to people today?
They're the same in every way. There's evidence. It's kind of surprising, but there is evidence from examining skeletons across the millennia that the switch to farming made people smaller than they had been as hunters. You know, when you compare in places like, say out in Greece, let's say, where people made that transition from having been hunters to having been in on the early part of the transition to domesticating crops and animals. And so you can find sometimes human remains from before the farming and human remains from after. And for 1,000 years or more after the transition to farming, people were smaller because the diet, things had gone downhill. Other writers like Jared Diamond, for example, he has characterised the switch to farming as the greatest disaster that the species ever inflicted upon itself. For lots of reasons. For a start, it means you've got to work every day. You know, you've got a set of chores, sun up, get to work all day, and then once it's too dark to work, you can go to your bed, and then you get up the next day and you do it all again. That's the daily grind that we've talked about before. But as well, from a nutritional point of view, it wasn't as good. There was easily accessible. If you had surplus grain, you could have plenty of bread and plenty of porridge. But it doesn't grow as big a body as the diet that successful hunter-gatherers would have been taken advantage of. So they were a bit smaller. I mean, when you compare hunter Greeks to the first farming Greeks, they're about 5 inches shorter, and they remain smaller for 1,000 years than their hunter predecessors. So they would be people completely like us, emotionally, mentally, in terms of their mental faculties. But on account of their diet, by that point, they may have been physically smaller. And of course, they would have been strong, on account of they lived lives that were very active, very physical, which is the difference, really, as everyone knows now. People that try to fit in a bit of exercise in amongst their otherwise sedentary existence. It's hard work that transforms you into something useful. So these people, because they lived lives of farming and mining and all of that, they might have been small. It might have been wee, but they'd have been wiry. And they'd have been physically in pretty good shape, I would have thought.
How did this place get its name?
The feature in the landscape at Llandudno is called the Great Orme. The mine is in the Great Orme, and Orme is Norse. It's a Viking word. The place today has a name that was applied to it by the Vikings more than 1,000 years ago. Orme means worm, or more particularly a serpent. So it's the great worm, the big serpent. And if you're approaching that part of the North Welsh coast from the sea in a ship, like a Viking longship, the Great Orme is a narrow snake of land that sticks out into the sea. So it does look like a sea snake swimming on the surface. So the message to get from that, the fact that it carries, if you like, a foreign name, is a sort of signpost to the understanding that people were coming in search of and were attracted to the place because of its material wealth.
Would the Mediterranean ships that went to Cornwall for its tin come here on the same trip to pick up copper?
Yes. For a start, the reason that people would have gone to such physical effort to get that stuff out of the ground was because they could benefit. And they couldn't possibly have needed all that copper for themselves. They weren't just taking all that out for their own personal use. So the assumption is that the bulk of it is for export. Now, that could be export over land within the British Isles, but there would also have been a demand for that copper. As the centuries and the millennia went on, the same people that need tin, they need copper. And the Great Orme mine at Llandudno, in the ancient world, was the biggest production centre for copper anywhere on the planet. That's where the most copper was coming out of the ground. So it would have exerted a kind of magnetic pull, without a shadow of a doubt.
Did this huge copper mine make the area wealthy?
Yeah, there's great wealth. If you're in control of a resource, gold, diamonds, oil, look at the Middle East, look at, anywhere there's a commodity that people want, if you have control of it, then you get wealthy. But people also get wealthy by having contact with you and exploiting the connection. So if I'm 1,000 miles away from you with your copper, but I establish a network of points along the way so that I can get that copper or things made of copper or things made of bronze moving. If I can control, like the Silk Road, if I can control the route, so anybody along the line is potentially in a position to exploit and become wealthy off the back of the copper. That was the thing with bronze. Later, people depended upon iron, and iron ore is more commonplace. There's more of it readily available. Copper and tin are thin on the ground. They always have been. And so bronze demanded sophisticated trading networks, because most people don't live where either copper or tin are, but everyone needs the bronze. So it forces people to make contacts and make relationships, because you've got to know a man who knows a man who can get you some copper. That's the way it works. So the dependency upon bronze, which is dependency on copper and tin, forced people to be sociable. So it's a funny thing. It forced them to be people. They needed networks of connection, and it was those networks that made people rich. And it was having the sophistication to organise and control the supply lines that made people wealthy, and that were the scaffolding of a whole complicated civilization and society. Funnily enough, the metallurgists call tin the sociable metal, because it mixes very readily and very easily with other metals. Obviously it mixes with copper to make bronze. And there's something pleasingly opposite about the idea of a sociable metal, because, you can't be a loner if you're in the business of bronze. You need connections, you need other people. So bronze brought people together in a fundamental sense.
What would the Phoenician merchants be bringing to trade for the great Orme's copper?
It's difficult to say. They'd be, obviously, things that we didn't have that were available in say, the Mediterranean world, would be things like wine, olives, olive oil, and of course, there was, to a certain extent, the ancient world would have had gold, and that's how trade works. I've got something you want, you've got something I want. Let's meet in the middle and swap. It's very, archaeologists and historians, this debate and argue to this day about exactly when it would have become about money. There's obviously an opportunity to trade all the time. If you've got whatever, timber, or if you've got, or copper, or if you've got people, slaves, and then you can swap that for something else that someone else has got. It's all down to people it's once they're farmers and they have surplus food and they've got time, because surplus food lets you specialise. So some people can specialise as metalsmiths, or they can specialise as merchants, because they're not having to spend every moment of every day sorting out food for tonight. So once they've got food organised and sorted and surplus, that's when societies become more sophisticated. Wherever you are, there'll be something you've got that somebody else doesn't have, and you swap it. But archaeologists can't decide really. From about the 6th century BC, there's coins moving around in the ancient world. So coins are being made in gold or made in silver. Latterly, there's also coins in bronze. So there's coinage, so there's transactions going on like that. I might turn up and I want 10 slaves, human beings, but I've got a bag of gold coins. And so there's a money transaction goes on I'll now take the slaves and you take the money. But in answer to your question, in the earlier days, there would always have been the opportunity to swap, trade, same thing. Whatever you've got from your part of the ancient world for whatever I've got. And in that part of Wales, it was copper. In Cornwall, it was tin. That was what they had. And they'd have swapped it for whatever, for wine, for oil, for other things that they needed but couldn't otherwise get their hands on. That's how trade works.
In an age like today, when new technologies seem to come and go in the blink of an eye, the fact that bronze remained dominant for around 2,000 years is extraordinary, isn't it?
It's difficult to get your head around, isn't it? A kind of a stability. It's one of the great mysteries of prehistoric archaeology is exactly why bronze stopped being the centre of everyone's world. Because it did. And that didn't happen overnight. But eventually, iron entered the frame. And there wasn't much iron around to begin with. And you know, you've got people who've been using bronze for centuries and centuries. And then this new metal starts coming in. And it's not immediately obvious that it was better. You know, you need higher temperatures to get iron so that it's liquid, so that you can pour it in the way that you can with bronze. Bronze becomes that liquid thing that you can pour into a cast, into a mould, at a lower temperature than does iron. And to begin with, when people were working iron, they could only get it to the point where it was like, where a smith could hammer it into shape. They could get it white hot or cherry red and then hit it with a hammer, like a blacksmith does. So it was difficult. And it's not immediately apparent, and it doesn't instantly give you a better tool. You know, bronze is a fantastic metal. If you break it, if you're ploughing with a bronze ploughshare, or if you're using a bronze sword and it breaks, you have to then take the broken bits and make them liquid again and recast them. You've got to go back to square one. An advantage that you have with an iron sword is that if it breaks into two bits, you can give it to the blacksmith. He can heat the two bits up, put them together and hammer them into one again. So iron's a bit easier to handle. It's a bit more cooperative. And any village would have had a blacksmith who could keep everybody's tools and weapons, you know, in one piece and in good working order. But after bronze having been so key to people's lives, it was what brought people together. It was the foundation of a complicated network of trading links and all the rest of it. It's difficult to understand exactly what happened to bronze. You know, archaeologists have speculated that, for example, there might have been a kind of a glut, that there may at some point have been overproduction of it. And if you've got overproduction of any commodity, the price drops. So people have suggested, I wonder if they were just making so much bronze that eventually there was no value in it. It was kind of, you know, it was a 10 a penny. And then there's been speculation that maybe the quality dropped out of it. You know, that people were making bronze, but it was to a lower standard. But the archaeological evidence doesn't really back up either of those theories. It doesn't really explain why you would suddenly, after bronze being so useful for so long, why it would be replaced by anything. And then other people have speculated that it might have been a simple kind of a loss of trust. You know how the money in your pocket, to an extent, it's based on everyone's confidence in it. You know, the pound sterling or the US dollar or whatever, or the euro, it requires us all to be confident in it. And human beings are fickle and strange, and things happen in the market. We know that stocks and shares, you know, it fluctuates all the time. And a lot of the time it's to do with confidence. So likewise, archaeologists have wondered if there wasn't just at some point, at some crucial moment, a loss of confidence in bronze. And also, because of all the things we've just been discussing about bronze, the fact that it made some people very rich and powerful, there may have been only a few limited opportunities to be rich and powerful based on bronze. And that situation might have sort of fossilised into something that nobody could get in on. You know, the people in Llandudno, the people in Cornwall, that certain people were just rich and powerful. And if you were on the outside of that, if you lived somewhere else, you could never get in. You know, you could never get a foot in the door to get in amongst the rich and the powerful. And that might have inspired eventually people thinking, stuff it, stuff your bronze. Do you know? They think, well, we'll use this iron. To begin with, it's going to be a bit awkward. It's not as pretty. You know, it doesn't look as good as bronze. It's a bit more workmanlike, and we'll have to work with it in a different way. But we can get our hands on it. We can get to it. You know, there's iron ore around. Let's just do it that way. And gradually people, and in those circumstances, with maybe some of the population looking to iron because it was giving them new opportunities, maybe that helped to break the wider confidence in bronze. You know, so there's, you know, it's just fascinating to speculate that these sort of modern-sounding tribulations, like the values of commodities rising and falling and affecting whole economies and whole societies, it's fascinating to speculate that some of that was happening, 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, when people were kind of turning their backs on bronze and really iron eventually, it takes a long time, but eventually it's all about iron. And the stranglehold that bronze had on everything for so long was over.
Bronze is a bit of a forgotten metal these days. But given it was so dominant for so long, it must have been good at what it did.
Yeah, no, it's so good. It's so hard. Some of the bronze that archaeologists recover from the ancient world, when it's analysed by metallurgists, it's so good that we can't make bronze that good. So the implication is that the bronze smiths had got so good at making bronze that they knew certain things about how to make bronze that we've forgotten, or that have been forgotten since that time. So they were so sophisticated in how they were making that metal that their version of it was better even than our version of it, which also goes to explain why it was so useful for so long. It's a very, very good metal. It's not inferior. It's not inferior to steel or iron in certain ways, depending on what you're using it for. But its weakness is the fact that there's not enough of the commodity, and it's not evenly spread around. And it would discourage certain people because they're thinking, we've got to get bronze, and we don't live anywhere near the tin, we don't live anywhere near the copper. So we're never going to get rich. There's got to be another way. And there's got to be another way. Why should we be dependent upon these people and the bronze? Isn't there another way? And then gradually iron becomes the answer to that conundrum. And in that way, it's like a change of the direction of the wind. It just changed the world. And a world that had been all about bronze for longer than anyone could possibly remember, just the day came when, actually, we're more about iron now. It's now mostly about iron, and off we went into the modern world.
When you're at the mines today, can you imagine them working at full tilt thousands of years ago?
Well, yes, because they're on such a scale. They're so big. You know, that chamber, that underground chamber, it's like a cathedral-sized space. It's huge. It's a vast underground, hollowed out by people working with bone and stone. And you're confronted by the fact that it's lots and lots of people working very hard for a very, very long time. So you get the feeling of how much it mattered. It wasn't just something trifling and something that people set about for a few days or a few weeks. They were at it for decades and centuries because it was so useful. And of course, the copper extraction was there in the modern era. There was so much malachite, which is the rock from which you make copper. There was so much there that it was still worthwhile to have modern industry there right up into our time, extracting copper there. You know, that part of the world, that part of Wales was very, very rich in copper. And it galvanised people and energised people for thousands of years. You know, once they found it, they kind of, in a sense, they never let it drop.
And do we know whether there was an industry there to use it, you know, like to make axe heads and the like?
Yes, there's evidence of smelting. You have to use heat to get copper from malachite, and that the evidence of that is there and in the surrounding area. You know, copper does sometimes occur like gold. You know, you sometimes get little nuggets of it, actually pure, native copper, maybe in a stream or lying on the surface. It will occur like that. But mostly it's within malachite, which is, if it's on a cliff face and it's exposed to the sea and the rain, you get these streaks of verdigris. So that's how people would have spotted it, probably. They would have seen it from the sea.
It's wonderful to think of this part of Wales being such an important cog in the developing Bronze Age, isn't it?
Well, gradually as time went on, yes, there's just no doubting it that the busiest source of copper in the ancient world at certain times was at the Great Orme. Nowhere else in the ancient world was so much copper coming out of the ground. Castles, commerce and travel have been writ large at the port of Dover for thousands of years. In sight of the White Cliffs, some 3,000 years ago, a beautiful boat plied its trade, a craft that today, quite simply, has the power to take your breath away. It's the oldest known seagoing boat in the whole world. It's the Dover boat. Next time, in my love letter to the British Isles. Check out my Instagram account, Neil Oliver Love Letter. And to ensure you get each new episode of the podcast as it goes live, don't forget to subscribe, write a review and share with your friends. For further reading about these favourite destinations of mine, you could try my book. It's called The Story of the British Isles in 100 Places, and it's published by Transworld. Neil Oliver's Love Letter to the British Isles is produced by Paul Ratcliffe and Neil Oliver for Fat Belly Films. The music is by Malcolm Goldie. The social media producer is Oscar, CFR. Additional research is by Evie, Lucian, Archie and Teddy. Finance was taken care of by Catherine and Trudy. Post-production is by Althorpe Studios. Photography is the work of Neil R, and the graphics are by Paul Plowman. And special thanks to the people across history who have made and continue to make these isles such an incredible place. This has been an FBF Podcasts production.